The Picture of Dorian Gray. Basil Hallward entertains his friend Lord Henry Wotton, showing him a portrait he has recently painted of a young man named Dorian Gray. Henry tells Basil it's his best work, but Basil doesn't want to exhibit the piece, it's far too personal. He reveals that Dorian has become quite meaningful to him, but he doesn't want Henry to meet him because he fears his friend might corrupt Dorian. Just then, Dorian arrives at Basil's house. As Dorian poses for Basil, Henry talks to him. Dorian finds the conversation so enticing that he goes into the garden with Henry, leaving Basil to finish the painting. Surrounded by flowers, Henry talks about hedonism and praises Dorian's youthful beauty, which he notes will someday disappear. Later, when Dorian sees the finished painting, he's overwhelmed by his own beauty and says he wishes the painting would age instead of him. Henry visits his uncle George to find out more about Dorian's background, learning that the young man is most likely quite wealthy but has a tumultuous family history. His grandfather disliked his father and arranged to have him killed. After learning this, Henry goes to a dinner party, where Dorian, also in attendance, is amazed at his ability to craft compelling but ultimately immoral and hedonistic arguments for mere entertainment. Inspired by Henry to seek pleasure in life, Dorian wanders one night into a shabby theater and falls in love with an actress, Sybil Vane. When he tells Henry about his feelings, Henry speaks skeptically about monogamy, especially for someone as beautiful and intriguing as Dorian. Still, Dorian insists that Henry and Basil come see Sybil act. That evening, Henry receives word that Dorian and Sybil are engaged to be married. Sybil Vane tells her mother about Dorian. Her mother is unsure about the betrothal, but she can't stop Sybil's excitement. Shortly thereafter, Sybil goes for a walk with her brother, James, who will soon sail for Australia. Later, Mrs. Vane tells James that she and his father were never married, saying their situation was similar to Sybil and Dorian's. Hearing this, James vows to kill anyone who mistreats Sybil. Henry tells Basil about Dorian's engagement. Basil is skeptical because he worries Dorian might link himself to someone unfit for him. Henry, for his part, thinks it will be amusing to see Dorian get married, but he doesn't approve of marriage, instead endorsing a more individualistic lifestyle. None of these thoughts are on Dorian's mind. He rushes in and gushes about Sybil, insisting that his friends must see her perform. Sybil performs terribly in Romeo and Juliet in front of Dorian, Basil, and Henry. Aghast, Dorian goes backstage, where Sybil says her love for him makes it impossible to act. Dorian says he has no interest in her without her art and leaves her weeping. At home, he notices that his face in the portrait Basil painted looks wretched, and he fears that his wish for the painting to age instead of him has come true. Frightened, he decides to make up with Sybil in the morning. In the morning, Dorian looks at the portrait again and is troubled to find that its transformation wasn't a dream. His painted face really does look newly depraved. As he ponders this, Henry visits and informs him that Sybil Vane has died. The implication is that she died by suicide, and Dorian instantly knows he's at fault. Nonetheless, Henry convinces him not to dwell on the matter. Basil comes to Dorian's house to console him. He's shocked to learn Dorian has gone to the opera. He comes back later and tries to talk to his young friend about the tragedy, but Dorian is unbothered. Dorian speaks like Henry, unwilling to dwell on Sybil's death. When Basil goes to look at the portrait, Dorian stops him and is terrified to learn that Basil now intends to exhibit the painting soon. Paranoid that somebody might glimpse the portrait, Dorian wraps it in cloth and has it moved to a room at the very top of his house. He reads a newspaper article about Sybil Vane's death. Upset by having to confront the details, he turns his attention to a book Henry gave him about a man who embraces sin and luxury. He becomes so engrossed that he almost forgets to go meet Henry later that day. Dorian becomes obsessed with the book about the sinful and luxuriant Parisian. As the years pass, he leads a hedonistic life, while also grasping for meaning, though his bouts with belief systems like Catholicism and Darwinism are short-lived because he's only really interested in pleasure. He nervously keeps tabs on the depraved changes reflected in his face in the portrait. One night shortly before Dorian's 38th birthday, Basil stops Dorian on his walk home. Basil has come to say farewell because he's leaving for Paris. Before he leaves, though, he wants to express his concern for Dorian, since he has heard so many wretched rumors about his immoral behavior. Dorian doesn't want to listen, but Basil insists. Rattled, Dorian impulsively decides to reveal his secret to Basil. Dorian brings Basil upstairs and shows him the portrait. Basil is horrified and tries to get Dorian to pray with him, but Dorian refuses. When Basil criticizes him for how he has been living his life, Dorian loses his temper and ends up murdering his old friend. In the gory aftermath, he calmly locks the door and begins to make arrangements for how to dispose of Basil's body. The next morning, Dorian summons a former friend, the scientist Alan Campbell. Like many of Dorian's acquaintances, Alan has intentionally distanced himself from Dorian recently and hoped to never interact with him again. However, Dorian is desperate. He tells Alan about Basil's death and asks for help disposing of the body. Alan refuses, but Dorian blackmails him into complying. Dorian attends a dinner that evening and is able to engage in light-hearted conversation until Lord Henry asks why he left so early the night before. Dorian suddenly becomes flustered and leaves the party, going home and burning Basil's left-behind belongings before rushing into the street and hailing a cab to a seedy part of town. Dorian goes to an opium den, where some women refer to him as Prince Charming. A sailor overhears and starts following Dorian, catching up to him and revealing himself to be James Vane. James is about to avenge his sister's death by killing Dorian, but Dorian tricks him, saying that, if he were Sybil's former fiancé, he would look older. James lets him go, but then a woman tells him Dorian has looked young for the past 18 years. Dorian hosts the attractive and popular Duchess of Monmouth, Henry, and a number of other guests. He flirts with the Duchess, who is clearly intrigued by him, but the light-hearted mood is disturbed when he unexpectedly faints. After regaining consciousness, he remembers that he fainted because he thought he saw James Vane's face in the window. On a hunting expedition around Dorian's property, the Duchess's brother is about to shoot a hare when, for reasons unknown even to Dorian himself, Dorian tries to stop him. The Duchess's brother shoots anyway, accidentally hitting a man. The man dies, deeply distressing Dorian, until, that is, Dorian learns that the man was James Vane. Dorian's conscience begins to weigh on him, so he makes a resolution to be good. Henry doesn't understand why he'd want to do such a thing. The two friends discuss Basil's disappearance and the likelihood that he was murdered. They also discuss other scandals in London, like the fact that Alan Campbell died by suicide. Dorian tries to reiterate his desire to be good, but Henry is uninterested in such aspirations. Alone, Dorian regrets wishing he could remain youthful while the portrait aged. He hopes he can rectify his misdeeds by turning over a new leaf. When he goes upstairs and looks at the painting, though, he knows this is impossible. Overwhelmed, he stabs the portrait with a knife. He instantly dies, at which point the wretched version of himself in the portrait reverts to the image of a beautiful young man.